Welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing how Hamas, the Islamist terrorist organisation based in Gaza, is rebuilding its terrorist infrastructure, rebuilding its terror tunnels and suppressing its own people, and also threatening the security of Israel. Warm welcome to the programme. And in this programme today we'll be discussing Hamas, the Islamist terrorist organisation based in Gaza, and how they're preparing for the next war against Israel. And to join me on today's programme, I'm joined by my good friend Michael McCann from Israel-Britain Alliance. Michael, welcome back to the Middle East Report.
Delighted to be here, Simon.
Michael, can you share with us, because the last time we did a programme on the Middle East Report, you discussed your campaign to raise awareness regarding possible UK and EU funding of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons that have been responsible for acts of terrorism against Israel, and making sure that that funding is not abused by the Palestinian Authority. Can you give us a little bit of an update of the event that you had in the House of Commons in June and the number of MPs that asked very important questions regarding this debate?
Sure, I'm delighted to do so. The debate in the 13th of June in the House of Commons was about foreign aid, but clearly we took the opportunity to use that debate to highlight the issues of payments to Palestinian prisoners, convicted terrorists in Israeli jails, paid salaries depending on how long they're actually in jail. Absolutely outrageous, nothing to do with welfare or looking after families or anything like that. And in addition, the absolute disgrace that the Palestinian Authority incites violence against the Jewish people. So therefore, we mobilised our supporters across all the different partners that we work with, and they sent 2,000 emails to parliamentarians asking them to attend the debate and asking them to raise these issues. And I'm delighted to say and to tell your viewers, because their hard work has paid off, that it made a tremendous difference. We had MPs from across Parliament, both in the government party and in the official opposition, Ian Austin, Joan Ryan, people like Matthew Offord MP, Sir Eric Pickles, Andrew Percy, all made contributions highlighting these issues and pointing out, and Jim Shannon, who's a member of Parliament from Northern Ireland, made a very powerful speech highlighting cases where people had been found guilty of terrorist attacks and were being paid salaries by the Palestinian Authority. So all these questions were put to the Minister, but as we know, a week can be a long time in politics, depending on what circumstances are, and the ministers have all changed now. So we've got a new Secretary of State and we've got new MPs that have been put on new duties within DFID, and I'm delighted to tell you, Simon, that they're actually taking notice of the issues that we've raised, and we are calling for the release of the Memorandum of Understanding, which sets out the rules for the payments of aid, which include a provision that the Palestinian Authority must renounce violence, something that they're not doing, and we are making a real difference. These are now under active review by DFID ministers. So I'd like to thank both the Revelation TV and in particular your viewers for making that decision to act, to send an email, because it made a difference. And I understand some people can be cynical about whether writing to MPs makes a difference, but it does. Take a look at that debate. You can get a copy of Hansard, which gives you the full record. You can read the full debate, or you can look at the short film that we've created to take out the salient points, and you can really see that because you pressed a button, sent an email to your MP, that they have turned up, they've made a contribution, and I'm hoping that we're the start of a road which will end with a victory, and it will stop making payments to people who support violence in this way.
Excellent work, good work, Michael. And let's have a look at this presentation done by Israel-Britain Alliance, particularly in speaking up for Israel in our Parliament and in the House of Commons.
if it were hijacked by those who want to use it in order to demonize Palestine, if it were hijacked by those who want to use it in order to demonize Palestine, if it were hijacked by those who want to use it in order to demonize Palestine.
But he's completely wrong to say that it's a myth that the Palestinian Authority fund terrorists.
Last month, Palestinian Media Watch showed how the PA sought to deceive international donors, shutting the Ministry of Prisoners Affairs and claiming that the PLO would assume responsibility for these payments. But this was merely a financial sleight of hand.
Is that perhaps some of that money would be better spent supporting projects that are working across both communities with Palestinians and Israelis.
But support for the helping the poorest people on our planet is harmed, and DFID suffers reputational damage when behaviour that contravenes aid agreements is unchallenged, and, despite being presented with the evidence, DFID takes no remedial action. Members of Yesh Din took part in an Arab celebration on the ruins of a Jewish community in Homesh, with attendees desecrating Jewish symbols and waving anti-Semitic posters, including one depicting a Jew with a spear through his head.
As we should in these last 46.5 seconds, be hopefully supporting Save a Child's Heart, who I am proud to serve as a UK patron of.
I have to say to my honourable friend, I say this with great affection and respect. It's no good just saying we don't fund terrorism.
I've got some specific questions I'd like to ask him. Will he publish the memorandum of understanding with the Palestinian Authority? Because I want to ask him as well whether he'll tackle the Palestinian Authority on the evidence of incitement.
Two Palestinian terrorists who repeatedly stabbed two women, killing the American lady, leaving the British woman with life-threatening injuries, are receiving a salary for the Palestinian Authority. When the Minister stands up to respond, I reckon to ensure that British aid money does not support Palestinian Authority incitement to commit violence. That's why they're supporting the Israel-Britain Alliance campaign to stop these abuses. That's why they're supporting the Israel-Britain Alliance campaign to stop these abuses. That's why they're supporting the Israel-Britain Alliance campaign to stop these abuses.
See, it's amazing what happens when we put pen to paper and decide to hold our political representatives to account, that if there's enough pressure applied, they have to stand up and take notice. So well done, Michael and Israel-Britain Alliance, for making headways in which many people thought was pretty near impossible.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about that clip is that it starts off with Sir Alan Duncan, prominent PSC supporter, links to the oil trade in a number of Arab countries. Perhaps that links up to his motivation for being involved, I don't know. But he sat on the right-hand side of the minister throughout that debate, trying to influence him in terms of how he responded. But you could see that, cross-party, Labour politicians and Conservative politicians coming together, presenting a united front, say we must deal with these issues, but most importantly, not just having a negative message. Andrew Percy MP making the point about Save a Child's Heart. There are fantastic causes that you can legitimately use taxpayers' funds to support, and I'm really delighted that we got such an excellent contribution from so many different MPs, and all because supporters and partners got involved in the IBA campaign, Revelation TV viewers, and we're making a difference.
Fantastic, good to hear. And Michael, you've now launched a new campaign, that's why you're on the programme, called Stop the War. So can you explain to us what your new campaign entails?
Sure, it's hashtag Stop the War. As you can see, I'm now getting trendy now, Simon, using hashtags now, but it's a very serious issue, and it's a genuine Stop the War campaign, not one of these fraudulent ones that you see, where we recognise the position that Israel faces in the Middle East. We recognise that on its southern border it faces threats from Hamas, its northern border from Hezbollah, and at the moment we can see that all too predictable cycle of violence just about to erupt again. If you look back even in recent history to Operation Protective Edge in 2014, what happens? Violence kicks off in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. We have seen that again with innocent Israelis being stabbed, and 40 people, innocent people, have been killed in the last year in Palestinian attacks. Then we see the rocket fire starting from Gaza into southern Israel, which we saw on the 21st of August. And then we see the predictable violence escalating. Then Israel steps in and has to defend its people. We have a ceasefire brokered when the international community gets fed up of seeing the scenes of violence on the TV, all created by Hamas. We have a ceasefire brokered, and all calms down, and then Hamas go back to creating more terror tunnels, creating new jihadis with their terrorist camps for young people, and rearming. And so therefore the Stop the War campaign, hashtag Stop the War campaign by the IBA, is to say to our government, we want you to get involved now to use all your political clout with international partners to tell Hamas no more. You cannot use your people as cannon fodder, and you cannot take the lives of innocent people in Israel. And the crucial thing is this, Simon. Terrorism, whether it's in Paris or Nice or Brussels or London, is exactly the same as terrorism in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem or Sderot. And that's the message that we want to get across to government ministers, that they redouble their efforts to ensure that we can stop the war.
Absolutely. But I think we need to put this into its political context, also historical context as well, that Israel had no other choice in the summer of 2014 but to launch a full-scale military operation against the Islamist terrorist organisation Hamas, primarily because 2/3 of all Israelis were living under the fear of Hamas's rockets and missiles. Sometimes it was only 10-15 seconds to actually get to a bomb shelter, which paralysed the nation. Combined with that Hamas was also then responsible for kidnapping and murdering 3 teenagers, which brought the nation on the edge of war, and in which any government, and particularly the Israeli government's first duty, is to protect its citizens. How important is it that we reconvey that message to the British government, to the European Union and other international organisations, that the first duty of any government is to protect its citizens?
Absolutely. I have to say that this is where the parallels have to be forced on our government and on other democracies, because I am sick of government ministers saying that Israel has to act proportionately and without giving any explanation about what that means. If rockets were firing on Glasgow or Cardiff or London or Belfast, what would our government be expected to do? Defend its citizens using whichever measures were necessary. And the situation is this: Hamas, in their charter, Hamas want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. No, there's no ifs, buts or maybes. It's absolutely unequivocal. So therefore it's not as if we don't know their game plan. They are terrorists, and I get really annoyed when I see news reports and it mentions Palestinian militants, as if somehow that is the distinction between Palestinian militants and Palestinian terrorism. There is no distinction. They are terrorists. And therefore, as a democracy, we have to defend Israel, protect that democracy, the only one in the Middle East, and we have to remind our government representatives that they would be asked to do exactly the same thing if their citizens were being attacked in this same way. And I'm fed up with the double standards. I'm sure many Revelation TV viewers are as well, and that's why we have to make our voice heard and do so through this campaign. Israel has got an utterly legitimate right to defend itself, and if we suspect Hamas kick off another conflict with Israel, then, and we can't stop the war, then our government, along with international partners, has to condemn that violence and also give us unequivocal support to the State of Israel.
Absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of who Hamas are and what the ideology that underpins this Islamist terrorist organisation known as Hamas, based in Gaza.
It's been in the news a lot lately, a cyclical conflict between the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and Hamas. As a result of that, people are asking questions like, what is Hamas and why is it considered a terrorist organization? Hamas is both a word and an acronym. In Arabic, Hamas means zeal, but the letters H-A-M-A-S are also part of an acronym, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yazin, a cleric and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood himself. Yazin founded Hamas in 1987 during what's called the First Intifada. Now, Intifada means uprising in Arabic. In 1988, Hamas established a charter, a mission statement. It said that its goal is to raise the flag of Allah over every inch of Palestine. Well, that's a problem, because when they say Palestine, they mean Israel. They mean everything in the area. It's not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which means the destruction of the Israeli state. From the start, Hamas engaged in violence. It was in 1993 that Hamas first utilized suicide bombings. Since then, Hamas has also engaged in a variety of terrorist tactics, including violence such as rockets into civilian areas, kidnappings, knife attacks, car bombings. It seeks out civilian casualties and believes that is part of its resistance against the Israeli state. But it was during the Second Intifada, known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that suicide bombings and daily terror attacks perpetrated by Hamas became a fact of daily life for the Israeli people. To prevent another round of suicide bombing inside Israel, the Israelis built a wall, a barricade, that now separates Israel proper from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In response to this, Hamas has decided to lob missiles and rockets into Israel as a means of inflicting terror on the Israeli population. Hamas refuses to recognize Israel or take part in the peace process. It seeks out civilian casualties to this day. In fact, it believes that seeking civilian casualties is an essential part of its resistance against the Israeli state. The U.S. first designated Hamas an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, in 1997. But not every country, Turkey, Russia, and many Arab states, consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization at all. If Hamas continues to direct violence against innocent civilians for a political purpose, which is the very definition of terrorism, well, then don't we have to call Hamas what it is? A terrorist organization.
It's a scene straight from a horror movie. Allahu Akbar! Terrorists emerging from underground tunnels and murdering innocent civilians. For Israeli communities along the Gaza border, this nightmare scenario is all too real. The Israeli Defense Forces destroyed dozens of these terror tunnels during Israel's 2014 war with Hamas. But in recent months, they have uncovered at least 2 more. Hamas has vowed to keep on digging the tunnels with the goal to infiltrate Israeli communities and murder or kidnap men, women, and children.
All I can say about the terror tunnels is that they do exist, but the IDF is doing all that they can to get rid of them.
Hamas's founding charter calls for jihad, or holy war, to destroy Israel. For Hamas, this remains non-negotiable. Destroying Israel is the reason for the group's existence. Since its founding in 1987, Hamas has pursued that goal relentlessly, conducting suicide bombings against Israeli civilians and launching thousands of rockets from its Gaza power base into Israel. Some of the rockets are supplied by Iran and are increasing in distance and strength.
In the past 3 years, we've been having Iranian missiles, like you see over here. They're more sophisticated missiles. They have an impact of 1,000 feet of complete damage. It can go through, 3-4-story high buildings that I've been experiencing myself in the larger cities on the southern part of Israel.
In another dangerous development, Hamas is now reportedly helping to train ISIS fighters from nearby Sinai and provide them with medical care and other support.
We understand that Hamas, at the end of the day, is a terror organization that is committed to Israel's destruction. They say it publicly. It's part of their charter.
As a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces, Lieutenant Libby Weiss has seen Hamas's terror campaign up close. She joins us today to discuss the Hamas threat and what Israel is doing to counter it.
Well, I'm sure that voice is very recognisable to many of you, and that was narrated by Eric Stakelbeck, formerly worked for CBN. But the dangers of Hamas to Israel's security and also the people of Gaza is very real. I mean, we have to talk about the terror tunnels, primarily because if it wasn't for Israel's military or defensive war against Hamas in Gaza in 2014, Israel would not have uncovered this terror plot to use these terror tunnels to spread terror and fear throughout southern Israel. And the plan was to kidnap as many Israelis from the kibbutzes and nearby villages surrounding Gaza, take many women and children as hostage, and also murder a few on the way, and then use that as a bargaining tool, which would have been absolutely horrendous for Israel to deal with. But these terror tunnels are being used to fund and supply weapons and arms, but also a way of using them as a terror tactic to attack Israel. What would you say to those people that say that Hamas needs them because they supply valuable aid and medical supplies coming into Israel?
That's just utter fiction. And let me make this absolutely clear. Israel in 2014, Operation Protective Edge, they had the absolute right to defend their country from the terrorism that they faced. And once they had found and exposed those terror tunnels, they had every right to destroy them. And bear in mind, I've seen the footage, and I have seen the exit sites from where the rockets are fired by Hamas in Gaza into Israel. They're beside schools, they're beside hospitals. We know that they fabricate pictures to suggest that the innocents have been killed when they themselves put the innocents in danger by their actions. But one other issue should also be highlighted, Simon, and it's this. You and I have both been to Sderot. We've visited that part, the police station where they keep all the spent shells. Horrific. I've visited the schools that have got 2 metre overhangs so the kids don't have to, every time they hear an alarm, they don't have to leave their lessons and studies. So we have seen all the things that Israel has to do as a democracy to defend its people, in stark contrast to Hamas deliberately putting their people in danger. Those terror tunnels are built using materials paid for by aid donors. Israel allows materials for rebuilding. It's got certain restrictions because obviously there's dual use materials that can be used for making weapons and violence. But Israel, as a democracy, is still allowing material to flow into Gaza because they are a democracy and they recognise that there are human beings there that have to be looked after. It is Hamas that then uses those materials instead of rebuilding from the destruction that they themselves created. They use them to build these terror tunnels, and these are not. It's not a Great Escape here where they're digging with small tools and soil. These are sophisticated operations, and it's really dangerous for the people of Israel, and that's why we must support them.
Absolutely. But when it comes down to these terror tunnels, I think we've got a bit of B-roll there. We're seeing this, one of the terror tunnels there being shown as a tourist attraction in Gaza. It also goes very much with the Hamas emphasis on terrorism and also inciting children to want to become a terrorist or a shaheed or a martyr for Hamas. But when it comes down to our elected representatives. Now we know that the British government, the European Union and the US government have prescribed Hamas as an international terrorist organisation. But why is there so much sympathy for Hamas amongst quite a number of parliamentarians? And why don't they see the real danger of Hamas instead of saying that Israel needs to negotiate with Hamas when Hamas... You can't negotiate with terrorists, and you can't negotiate with these people because all they want is the destruction of Israel, and all they promised Israel was a hudna, which in Arabic is a temporary cessation of violence until they're stronger and they can carry out a further war to attack Israel.
Yeah, there's no question about talking peace. You can't talk peace with terrorists who want you to be wiped off the face of the earth. It's just a non-starter. I suppose we're getting back to let's just not beat about the bush, people like Jeremy Corbyn who calls them his friends. But remember I talked about fraudulent Stop the War campaigns. Well, he's the leader of one of the biggest fraudulent Stop the War campaigns, because what happens is when Israel has to step in and defend its people from attack, then we have a Stop the War campaign, a completely and utterly mendacious campaign starting in our country, which actually wants to stop Israel from defending its citizens. It's nothing to do with not wanting bloodshed, because they don't condemn Hamas when Hamas fire rockets into Israel. So therefore, what motivates them, Simon? I have to confess, I have to guess, but I have to confess I don't know what goes on inside people's heads to think that you can somehow endorse an organisation like Hamas. But I think it's even deeper than that. I think people like Jeremy Corbyn and people support his political ilk, that they actually don't like the West. After the Paris attacks, the Paris terrorist attacks, the Stop the War website said this was the West reaping what it sowed from being involved in Islamic lands. Extraordinary statement. They immediately, once it gets some condemnation, they took it off their website. But they don't like the West. The ironic thing is that they're allowed to say anything they want because we live in democracies. They wouldn't be allowed to say any of these things if they lived in some of the countries that they seek to defend. But it's a bizarre and an unexplainable position to me that people can think that somehow that business can be done with Hamas, with Hezbollah, people, organisations that are dedicated to the destruction of a democratic state, the only democratic state in the Middle East. And quite frankly, what people have to do when it comes to these politicians is seek out their views, which we want people to do through getting involved in our campaigns, and then take the appropriate measures when it comes to the ballot box, because we live in a democracy and we can get rid of our politicians, should we choose to.
Some cases that's a very good idea, so thankfully we do have that option. But I suppose we have to look at ourselves and look at this situation as a whole, I think, Michael, and we have a look at the situation in Gaza and the fact that Hamas use asymmetrical warfare. In other words, they put deliberately children and women in using them as human shields in order to fire rockets and missiles at Israel from highly dense population centres. I know that Gaza is very dense, it's very populated, but they would deliberately fire those rockets and missiles from high residential buildings, from hospitals, from schools, to encourage Israelis to actually target those firing spots where those rockets are being fired in order to maximise civilian casualties. So when we look at the reconstruction of Gaza, and Hamas is saying that we need international aid to rebuild Gaza, how can we ensure that money is being sent to actually help the people of Gaza, because we need to see Hamas free. We need to see Gaza free of Hamas to actually help the people of Gaza. But at the same time, we have to make sure that the aid money that we're giving for the reconstruction of Gaza is not spent on rebuilding Hamas's terrorist infrastructure and terror tunnels.
I think there's a humanity and a compassion that most people, and as Christians we have, for people who are in dire circumstances where we want to help, and that's why the British public have been extremely generous in any campaigns, whether it be in Nepal or Pakistan when it was dealing with the floods, where people put their hands in their pockets, their purses, and they send money into campaigns in order to help people who are suffering. The problem that you have is that organisations like Hamas take advantage of our generosity. They take advantage of the fact that we want to help people in need. They wouldn't do it. And therefore we have to expose that, and we have to try and get aid to the people who need it most, but we also have to recognise, and we've seen recently both with World Vision and UNDP, that Hamas infiltrated these organisations, and just as we found that there was misuse of British aid money through the Palestinian Authority, the same is true, and probably even more so for Hamas, because they are using aid funds that they've been given, materials that have been given to rebuild, to rearm, to create the terror tunnels. And we know from the pictures that we've seen earlier in the programme that they're training a new generation of young people to be martyrs, and that's what we face. And therefore we have to have a realistic structure on how we are going to respond to that. And in my view, the British government isn't doing that as it should just now, because they're trying to keep alive a two-state solution, which Hamas have no interest in, because they don't accept that Israel's got a right to exist, and the Palestinian Authority don't have any interest in, because they've refused Bibi Netanyahu's offers for peace talks. So, I think we have to be realistic and say that we are not going to get we certainly can't negotiate or even talk to Hamas, who are a terrorist organisation that want to see the people of Israel destroyed and Israel wiped off the map. And Fatah and President Mahmoud Abbas are not serious partners for peace.
So let's have a look now at a summer training camp organised by Hamas this summer, and that was in the summer of 2016. What we can see here is a Hamas training camp for teenagers, and based in Gaza, and you can see that they are training teenagers living in Gaza to carry out paramilitary exercises and missions, and therefore you can see here them jumping through fires, jumping through hoops, training with guns, weapons, martial arts, in order to prepare themselves for a potential conflict with Israel. And we can also see with the music at the beginning that this was a Hamas-inspired training camp, and also as you see there, you see the Hamas flags and also pictures of Hamas terrorists that have carried out operations against Israel. Now, where is the international condemnation of these Hamas terror camps for teenagers? And surely the world should be condemning Hamas for preparing a next generation of potential jihadists against Israel, which amounts to state child abuse, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's state child abuse. You know, some of the pictures in some of the earlier clips showed little children, you know, dressed up in full military gear, and we know that Palestinian Media Watch also highlight other events that take place which, you know, are about commemorating violence or creating incitement for violence. So we know the game. In terms of, I'll use the British government as an example. Here we have a classic position where they're trying to keep, unrealistically, doors open. So you have DFID attempting to work with organisations which have got clear links to terror in order to help the poorest people in the world. No, you could argue that there's a legitimacy there because they want to help the poorest people, but there's a naivety associated with it as well, because then you have the dead hand of the Foreign Commonwealth Office involved in this, who want to maintain relationships with all the other Arab nations that exist. They're trying not to offend them. They're trying to keep the door open for a two-state solution negotiation. And because they are trying to keep the door open to those talks, they hold back from giving the full-throated condemnation that scenes like this deserve. And if you're a terrorist and you're getting the message, well, you know, we don't like what you're doing, but we're not going to take any precipitative action in terms of stopping you what you're doing. Now, as a terrorist, you're going to say, well, I'm going to get away with this, and I'm going to continue to do it. And so we've also got the situation where Iran are involved both with Hamas and Hezbollah, you know, given those long-range rockets which can now hit any part of Israel. And all those threats are growing every single day, even with Israel being blessed with Iron Dome defences. So therefore, there's an unrealistic position among diplomats across the Western Hemisphere, which is that somehow you can do business with these people. All they're doing is take advantage, quite frankly, of that desire to see a settlement, which they don't even believe in. This Hamas will never, ever countenance recognising the State of Israel, doing business with the State of Israel, and stop creating violence against the State of Israel. And politicians have to man up and be realistic about the possibilities for peace.
Absolutely. You can say that about the Palestinian Authority as well, pretty much in the same position. But I have to ask you about the position of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, or Foreign Office, particularly because in talks I've heard and material that I've read, that they're very keen to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state, and they don't really care if that's Hamas run or whether that's run by Fatah, the so-called more moderate faction of the Palestinian Authority. But surely there are steps that the British government can do with our partners such as the American government, also our European partners in the European Union, to make sure that real genuine steps of reconciliation or peace are made, rather than allowing the Palestinians to build up a terrorist infrastructure against Israel with no actual commitment involved in actually negotiating a settlement at all.
Yeah, the British government, the American government, other governments have to be realistic about the prospects for peace, and they also have to divert precious resources to areas that can make a difference. And that was one of the issues that was highlighted during the 13 June debate in the House of Commons, because, as you'll have seen from the clip, a number of the MPs were saying, well, why aren't we supporting this charity? For example, you could Save a Child's Heart.
Yeah.
There are organisations like Cherish that do a lot of good work between little Palestinian children and Israeli children who have been affected and traumatised by the violence that has been created by the Palestinian side. There are loads of opportunities. Incidentally, it ain't new, because when Rwanda was found to be operating with terrorists in the Congo, the British government stopped direct aid and rediverted the money elsewhere. Similarly in Malawi. So there's ways that the British government could act right now which would stop the money being filtered off into Hamas's pockets and then and terrorism, the pockets of terrorism, and it could actually make a real difference. But I've got a very strong suspicion that the Arabist Foreign Office, which is often been accused of being Arabist in terms of its thinking, is preventing any significant change because they want to, as I've said in several occasions now, unrealistically keep doors open for peace, which quite frankly closed enough a long time ago.
Absolutely. But I think it's important that we also remember, according to figures I have here, this is from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, that between 2006 and 2011, 188 Palestinians died building the terror tunnels, and 10% of those died were under the age of 18. So we have to ask, when Western aid money goes for the rebuilding and the reconstruction of Gaza, what effective measures can the government put in place to ensure that Hamas don't get their hands on this money, and secondly to ensure that they don't rebuild their terrorist infrastructure against Israel and rebuild these terror tunnels and use that money to incite the next generation of Palestinians living in Gaza to be the next Hamas terrorists?
I think it's exceptionally difficult, and I think that the only way you can deal with it is to divert your finances through organisations that you can be as close as possible 100% sure that they're bona fide and that they will spend the money properly. And you know, I simply do not believe that that level of detail has been looked at by the British government, because they're trying to keep a policy alive which is, quite frankly, dying on its feet.
Absolutely. And also the other thing I think we have to do as well is that we have to acknowledge that Israel supplies tons, like hundreds of thousands of tons of aid and humanitarian aid to Gaza to help the people of Gaza, but it's Hamas, isn't it? I mean, look at the plight of Christians living under Hamas. We're having churches being burnt, Christians being persecuted. There's an extreme form, the most extreme form of Sharia law that's actually implemented. So in some places, even people of Gaza playing music at a wedding are murdered by Hamas terrorists because they don't like the sound of the music. Strict dress code as well as dietary code, and life is sheer misery under Hamas.
It's absolutely grim. And but I think a lot of people forget there's two ways to get into Gaza. There is the crossing that Israel controls, and there's the crossing that Egypt controls. Yep. Very few people criticise the Egyptians for having an unusual view on when they should open it and when they should close that border. But Israel has increased the tonnage of materials going into Gaza because they know that people are suffering. And utterly contrary to the caricature that's painted by Israel's enemies, Israel wants to help people that are suffering. Because they're a decent democratic nation that wants to do as much as it can to help its fellow man and women in that particular tough area. But I saw a picture which was pretty classic in terms of Hamas and how they behave. It was a Hamas terrorist who was running across the street, and what did he do to get to the other part of the street? He picked up a child and used the child as a human shield in order that if there was any, that it would put the IDF off from firing against the terrorists because they were fearful they could hit the child. And that really sums up the difference. Israel is a democracy which cherishes human life, Hamas is a terrorist organisation which, quite frankly, isn't interested in human life, and it uses its people as cannon fodder.
Also, the other aspect I think we need to look at this and look at the leaders of Hamas, like Mashal and others, that have amassed millions and millions of pounds. That these guys are now multi-millionaires thanks to foreign aid money going into Gaza, and also this very lucrative tunnel business in which they've been smuggling in cars and luxury goods, building themselves big expensive villas as well. Surely that's another leading question mark to ensure that we're not actually lining the pockets of these Islamist terrorists by actually giving them aid money that they can pocket for themselves.
Well, you know, it's you really shouldn't even need to say it. It's so wrong, but we know it's taking place, and we know that the World Vision story and the United Nations Development Programme money, that Israel have cited examples of how that money was funneled into Hamas and how that money was used. World Vision and UNDP claim that they've got a defence for this, and it's not as bad, but I've got to be honest with you, in my experience, there is no way that if they put people in control, or there's people who have infiltrated their organisations, they will not be able to control, you know, how that money's been spent, or determine exactly how it's been siphoned off. And if Israel, and this is where I think the strength of our democracy, and bear in mind it's got a judicial system which is free and open, the Israelis would not have come out and made those announcements had they not made sure that their case was rock solid, every T crossed and I dotted, because they have to go above a measurement which would be used in a democratic state to prove that people have been doing things wrong, and that's the difference between the two leaderships of both these particular areas. But the corruption is utterly rife. We know that both in Hamas, and we know it also in the other Palestinian leadership. I mean, Yasser Arafat was one of the most corrupt individuals on the planet, and you know, I'm afraid that many have followed in his footsteps.
Yeah, he also went to death as a billionaire, I believe, as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to talk about this, very shocking story regarding World Vision. I mean, according to my notes here, that the regional operation manager for the international NGO World Vision was diverting 10 million pounds of donations to, instead of helping the people of Gaza, was actually then used to actually fund the Hamas wing, which is the military wing of Hamas. Now surely World Vision would actually have checks and balances to make sure that money that they were giving to one of their employees was being used correctly, instead of being used to actually fund indirectly terrorism against Israel. And so it's shocking to think that World Vision indirectly has been funding Hamas and funding terrorism.
But if you put someone in charge of an operation and they're in control of everything, you know, creating invoices, creating a paper trail, people back in World Vision headquarters thinking that everything's been done appropriately and all the relevant procedures have been followed. If you've got someone at the very top of the shop who's corrupting it, then there's no way you can control it. And that's why I was disappointed by their dismissal of the allegations in the first instance, because I thought it showed a lack of understanding of how their money could be diverted to the cause of terrorism. And I'm pretty convinced, with the evidence that I have seen, that there are compelling cases against both World Vision and UNDP. And that doesn't help us in any way of getting to a peaceful settlement in this very difficult part of the world. But I perhaps should have said this earlier, Simon, there's one way this can all stop. Hamas can give up terror, and then they can become a partner for peace. And the Palestinian Authority could simply get around the table and start talking to people. And the leaders, that way we get a settlement. And then there's no more violence, there's no more bloodshed, there's no more people killed, and there's no more people maimed. But sadly, that's a pipe dream at the moment.
Michael, we're down to the last 6 minutes of the programme left, so I've just got a couple of things to say, and I just want to make a comment on what you've just made. Back in the summer of 2014, my wife and I went to Israel, went to go and see our friends in that summer, the end of that summer, sort of in September of 2014, just barely weeks after the war came to an end. And my Israeli friends were absolutely in outrage at that war and saying, look, Gaza has the best beaches in the whole of Israel, virtually the whole of that Levant area of the Mediterranean. Why don't they build hotels? Why don't they build restaurants? Why don't they actually enjoy living? But instead they're a death cult. They believe in death, and they want to support death. Now, a couple of questions. A, what can our viewers do regarding World Vision? And secondly, how can they get behind this campaign to stop the war?
Well, World Vision relies on donations, and my view is that until you can be assured that those donations are going to be properly help the poorest people in the world, then and alleviate poverty, then my view is that you've got to take a view on whether or not you wish to continue funding that particular charity, or move your money elsewhere to an organisation which does meet high standards in terms of accounting for the money that it receives from the general public. In terms of wider issues, we know as I mentioned at the start, the chronological order of events that take place. The violence starts to escalate, rockets are fired, and then we get into this familiar pattern of violence when Israel is forced to defend its citizens and look after its own people, as any other democracy would. So therefore, if we can put pressure on the British government to put further pressure on Hamas to let them know that this will not be tolerated, that's the only thing they're going to listen to. In addition to that, we should be stopping any sort of funding that's getting to them. And that's why I would urge all Revelation TV viewers to go into the Israel-Britain Alliance website. You'll see our current campaign, www.israelbritain.org.uk. Hopefully people are beginning to become accustomed to that website. And they can look at the campaign, they can see that the letter that they send will go automatically to Boris Johnson, our new Foreign Secretary, and it will automatically go to their constituency MP, because I'm an optimist by nature, Simon, but if we end up in another conflict, then we will then be in a strong position to say that we believe that our government should support Israel against terrorism in its hour of need. And it's important that we raise the issues now in order that we're prepared if, sadly, violence does break out, and we need to protect Israel's democracy and protect Israel's people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, considering that Europe has experienced an unprecedented wave of Islamist terrorist attacks carried out by ISIS this summer, shouldn't there be that realisation that the ideology behind ISIS and these terror attacks is exactly the same as Hamas, and their links, and they have strong links then to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Of course it's exactly the same, but the thing is that we've only now starting to realise the existential threat that Israel faces every single day of the week, because we have seen these terrible attacks on our doorstep. We've seen people being maimed and killed, and in some cases, governments reacting in a certain way. There's a lot of controversy in France at the moment about how they are choosing to deal with that situation. So therefore, in terms of all the things that have been happening on our doorstep, this is a crucial thing. Terror is terror is terror. It doesn't matter which part of the world it takes place in, and by not facing up to the reality that Israel faces every day, we are doing our democracy a disservice. And that's why we have to get fully behind the democratic state of Israel and the Jewish people.
Absolutely, because we know the consequences are deadly if we don't. Because Israel's on the front line in the Middle East confronting these dangerous Islamist terrorist organisations, and if Israel wasn't there, would this mean an end to Western civilization? Because I certainly think it would.
Well, if you look at the map, there's a cradle, and Israel's democracy is so strong that's keeping out all the nations around about it that don't want to see it exist. That power is there because there's a democratic Israel defending its people. And as a fellow democratic nation, we should be developing even more common cause with the state of Israel and urging our government to do the same, to protect people and to stop the war.
Excellent. And before we go, Michael, you got any plans to have a debate on this issue, on Stop the War and the rearming of Hamas in the House of Commons?
Well, the House of Commons has been on its recess, although I'll be the first to say that all your MPs, but I'm sure will be working hard on their constituencies, because that was something that always annoyed me, that people thought you were on a long holiday when actually you were working in your constituency office. So they'll all be doing the same. The crucial thing for the Stop the War campaign is highlighting the issue, and ultimately, if we need to move it up a notch, we will do so.
Excellent. Michael, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report, and I wish you every success with your new campaign, Stop the War, and it's about time that we stopped this war in which Hamas is engaged against Israel using our taxpayers' money, instead of using money to rebuild homes and provide aid. Unfortunately, they're building up their terrorist infrastructure. So thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. I'm going to leave you with a very interesting song. One is an Israeli song, another one is a Hamas song. And what it shows is the difference between the two cultures. One full of hate and one full of love. One wanting to destroy the entire state of Israel and sacrifice children if they need to. The other, a professionally trained army that comes to the defense of its people and also its civilians. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
زلزل أمن إسرائيل تقدم يا ابن أقصانا ودك الأرض نيرانا وزلزل أمن إسرائيل أشعل فيه بركانا المقاومة تقصف وتعلن هناك مزيد